The boardroom felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windows. I sat at the polished table, watching Miles place his hand on Sierra's shoulder like he owned her. The other executives shifted in their seats, some smirking, others looking uncomfortable. My heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "I'm excited to announce Sierra's promotion to operations director," Miles said, his voice carrying that fake confidence I'd grown to hate. "She's shown incredible leadership potential in just 6 months." A few people clapped. Someone even chuckled. I kept my face calm, but inside betrayal burned like acid. 8 years. 8 years I'd given this company everything. I'd missed my sister's wedding for a client emergency. I'd worked through Christmas when the supply chain collapsed. I'd saved this place from bankruptcy twice. And now they were laughing. Sierra squeezed Miles's hand and smiled at the room. She was wearing the blue dress I'd complimented last week. The irony wasn't lost on me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, while my world crumbled around me. "Laura has been invaluable to our growth," Miles continued, not even looking at me. "But it's time for fresh perspective." Fresh perspective. That's what they were calling it. I gathered my notes slowly, each page sliding into my folder with a soft whisper. The room had gone quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. Everyone was watching me, waiting for a breakdown, for tears, for screaming. They wanted drama they could gossip about later. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Standing up, I smoothed my skirt and looked directly at Miles. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve this company," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I wish you all the best." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I saw confusion flicker across faces. This wasn't the script they'd expected. Miles's confident smile faltered for just a moment. He'd probably rehearsed this scene, imagining me begging or crying or making a scene. Instead, I walked to the door with my head high. My composure seemed to unsettle the room more than any tantrum could have. As I reached for the handle, I heard whispers starting behind me. "That was weird," someone muttered. "She took that better than I thought," another voice said. Miles cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Well, let's move on to the quarterly reports." But I could feel the shift in energy. My calm reaction had thrown everyone off balance. Good. Let them wonder what I was thinking. My name is Laura Keaton. I'm 38 years old, and for 8 years, I was the operations director at Hartman & Company. But that title never captured what I really was. I was the backbone. I was the person who made sure everything worked when it should have fallen apart. While Miles glad-handed clients and took credit for our success, I was the one working until midnight, fixing problems before they became disasters. When our biggest supplier tried to break their contract, I flew to Detroit and negotiated a better deal in person. When our warehouse flooded, I coordinated the emergency response and had us back online in 2 days. I missed family dinners, canceled vacations, and ended an engagement because my fiancé said I loved the company more than him. Maybe he was right. I'd poured everything I had into Hartman & Company, and it had grown from a struggling startup into a national supply chain powerhouse. The company newsletter always featured Miles's picture, but everyone who mattered knew the truth. Vendors called me directly. New hires were told to watch how I handled things. The board members would corner me at company events to ask my opinion on expansion plans. For years, I thought my dedication would be rewarded. I thought loyalty mattered. I thought competence would win over politics and pretty faces. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. 5 years ago, Hartman & Co. was hemorrhaging money and losing clients. Miles had inherited the company from his father, but he had no idea how to run it. Boxes piled up in wrong warehouses. Shipments went to wrong addresses. Our biggest client threatened to leave. That's when I stepped in. I'd been hired as an assistant operations manager, but someone needed to take charge. I redesigned our entire logistics system, renegotiated contracts with 3 major suppliers, and implemented tracking software that cut our error rate by 70%. Within a year, we'd not only saved our biggest client but signed 5 new ones. Revenue doubled. Miles started getting invited to industry conferences where he'd give speeches about innovative leadership. The irony was painful, but I didn't mind staying in the background. I believed in the work. The success changed Miles, though. He started wearing expensive suits and driving a flashy car. He hired a personal assistant and began talking about scaling up and market disruption. He brought in consultants who charged thousands to tell us things I'd already figured out. But the worst change was how he started looking at me. Not with gratitude or respect, but with something that looked almost like resentment. As if my competence was somehow embarrassing to him. That should have been my first warning sign. Sierra joined our marketing team 6 months ago. She was 26, fresh from business school, with a bright smile and an impressive resume. I was the one who interviewed her, actually. She seemed smart and eager, and we needed help with our digital campaigns. At first, everything seemed normal. Sierra did good work, asked thoughtful questions, and stayed late to learn our systems. I even mentored her during her first month, sharing insights about our industry and client base. But I started noticing small things. Miles would stop by her desk more often than necessary. He'd laugh a little too loud at her jokes during meetings. When she presented ideas, he'd nod enthusiastically and ask follow-up questions he never bothered with for other employees. Then came the private conversations. I'd walk past Miles's office and see them huddled together, voices low, papers spread between them. When I asked about these meetings, Miles would give vague answers about marketing initiatives and fresh perspectives. Sierra started dressing differently too. More expensive clothes, subtle but noticeable. She'd arrive early and leave late, always seeming to time her schedule with Miles's. Other employees began whispering about their working lunches and after-hours strategy sessions. I told myself I was being paranoid. Miles was married. Sierra seemed professional. But the signs were all there, written in lingering glances and shared smiles across conference tables. The changes started small. Miles began arriving late to our weekly operations meetings, claiming he had strategic calls to handle. When he did show up, he'd spend most of the time on his phone or whispering with Sierra, who had somehow started attending meetings she had no business being in. My emails to Miles went unanswered for days. Projects I'd been managing for months were suddenly reassigned to other departments. When I tried to discuss budget allocations for the next quarter, Miles would cut me off and say we'd circle back later. We never did. The real slap came during our monthly client review. I'd prepared a detailed presentation about efficiency improvements that would save us $40,000 annually. Miles barely glanced at my slides before turning to Sierra. "What's your take on this?" he asked her, as if she had any experience with operations management. Sierra launched into a speech about reimagining our workflow paradigms and leveraging synergistic opportunities. It was buzzword soup with no substance, but Miles nodded like she'd just discovered fire. "Brilliant," he said. "Laura, let's table your proposal and explore Sierra's approach instead." My proposal ended up in a filing cabinet. Sierra's paradigm shift became a 3-month project with a dedicated budget. I watched from the sidelines as she fumbled through basic logistics concepts I could have explained in 5 minutes. I've always been detail-oriented. It's what made me good at my job. So when I started reviewing our monthly expense reports, the irregularities jumped out immediately. There were consulting fees listed under Sierra's name, payments that didn't match any work I could identify. The invoices were professional-looking, but something felt off. The projects they described were vague, things like strategic marketing assessment and operational efficiency consultation. When I checked our records, I couldn't find any deliverables or reports corresponding to these payments. Each invoice was just under the threshold that required board approval. Smart. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, always for consulting work that seemed to evaporate the moment it was paid for. I dug deeper, cross-referencing dates with Sierra's timesheet and project logs. The pattern became clear. She was billing us for consulting work during hours when she was already on the payroll as a full-time employee. It was double-dipping, and it was adding up to serious money. Part of me wanted to march into Miles's office immediately and demand an explanation. But I'd learned to be careful around him lately. His mood swings were unpredictable, and he had a way of turning conversations around to make me look like the problem. Instead, I started keeping copies of everything. Invoices, emails, project timelines. If I was going to make accusations, I needed proof that couldn't be explained away. The annual company celebration was held at the downtown hotel, the same place we'd celebrated every year since I'd been here. I wore my black dress, the one that made me feel confident and professional. I was genuinely excited because the evening would highlight our biggest success of the year, the Morrison Industries contract I'd spent 6 months securing. The presentation began with Miles taking the stage, looking polished in his new suit. He talked about growth and vision and teamwork. Then he started describing the Morrison deal, except he never mentioned my name. This incredible achievement was the result of innovative thinking and fresh perspectives, he said, gesturing toward the audience. I want to recognize someone who exemplifies our company's future direction. I assumed he was building up to acknowledging my work. Instead, he called Sierra to the stage. The applause was polite but confused. Several people glanced at me, knowing I'd been the one living and breathing the Morrison project for months. I'd been the one flying to their headquarters, negotiating terms, managing their impossible timeline requirements. Sierra took the microphone with a gracious smile. "Thank you so much," she said. "This project really challenged me to think outside the box and leverage cross-functional synergies." I sat frozen while photographers captured her moment. The betrayal was complete and public. Miles wasn't just stealing my work. He was rewriting history, while I watched from the audience. Miles called me into his office first thing Monday morning. He was sitting behind his desk with that practiced expression he wore when delivering bad news to clients. Professional but sympathetic. Firm but caring. "Laura, I think we need to have an honest conversation about your future here," he began. I sat across from him in the same chair where I'd presented cost-saving proposals and problem-solving strategies for 8 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Your dedication has been incredible," he continued, "but I think you've plateaued. Sometimes fresh leadership is what a department needs to reach the next level." Fresh leadership. Sierra, the woman who'd been here 6 months and couldn't explain the difference between gross margin and markup. "I'm prepared to offer you a generous severance package," Miles said, sliding a folder across his desk. 6 months' salary and extended health benefits. Plus, I'll provide excellent references for your next opportunity. I opened the folder and scanned the terms. It was actually a decent package, more than legally required. Miles wasn't being cruel. He was being careful. This way, if anyone asked, he could say he'd treated me fairly. "I need some time to think about this," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But we both knew there wasn't really a choice. Sierra had already moved into my projects. My keycard access had been mysteriously restricted. This meeting was just a formality. Packing 8 years of your life into cardboard boxes is harder than you might think. Every item tells a story. The coffee mug from our first major client win. The paperweight from the trade conference where I'd networked us into 3 new partnerships. Photos from company events where I'd actually believed I was part of something lasting. My coworkers walked past my office like it was a crime scene. A few stopped to offer awkward condolences, but most just pretended not to see me. I understood. Office politics are complicated, and people need to protect themselves. I was nearly finished when Sierra appeared in my doorway. She was holding a small scented candle, the kind you buy at discount stores. "I brought this for the office," she said with that bright smile. "I hope we can still be friends, Laura. I know this transition is hard, but I really admire everything you've accomplished here." The audacity was breathtaking. She was already referring to my office as the office, like I'd never existed. The candle was probably meant to replace my scent with hers, marking her territory. "That's very thoughtful," I said, continuing to pack my books. She set the candle on what used to be my desk and lingered for a moment, maybe expecting me to say more. When I didn't, she wished me luck and left. I finished packing in silence, then carried my boxes to the elevator for the last time. My apartment felt too quiet after years of constant phone calls and urgent emails. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen. My savings account balance stared back at me. $68,000. More than most people my age had saved, but not enough to retire on. Then I remembered something else. My employment contract had included equity compensation. 1% of company shares vesting over 5 years. I'd been there 8 years, so I own more than my initial allocation. With our recent growth, those shares might actually be worth something significant. I pulled out my contract and read through the fine print I'd signed so eagerly 8 years ago. Most of it was standard stuff, but one clause caught my attention. It was something I'd actually helped draft during our restructuring 3 years ago. In cases where management conflicts of interest materially compromise company assets or fiduciary responsibilities, senior equity holders may petition for emergency board oversight and potential leadership restructuring. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. It was designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of financial irregularities I'd been noticing. The kind that involved unauthorized consulting payments and questionable expense accounts. For the first time since leaving the office, I smiled. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as I'd thought. Elaine Porter's law office was minimalist and intimidating. All clean lines and expensive furniture. She was younger than I'd expected, but had the kind of sharp confidence that comes from winning difficult cases. "Tell me what happened," she said after I'd explained why I was there. I laid out everything. The suspicious invoices, the consulting payments, the way Sierra had been double billing for work. I showed her the expense reports and project timelines that didn't match up. Elaine studied the documents carefully, making notes in precise handwriting. "This is interesting," she said finally. "If we can prove systematic financial misconduct, your equity clause becomes very relevant." She explained how these cases typically worked. Corporate shareholders had rights, but exercising them required solid evidence and careful timing. The good news is that you helped write this particular clause, so you understand its intent. The bad news is that building a case takes time and money. "How much time?" I asked. 2 to 3 months if we're thorough. Maybe longer if they've covered their tracks well. I thought about Sierra sitting in my old office, probably ordering new furniture with company funds. Miles was probably already planning how to restructure the operations department around his girlfriend's limited experience. What would I need to prove? I asked. Breach of fiduciary duty. Misuse of company assets. Conflict of interest that materially harms shareholder value. Elaine leaned back in her chair. "It's doable, but you need to be certain you want to go down this path." I spent the next 2 weeks becoming a detective in my own former life. I still had access to some company systems, an oversight that would probably be corrected soon. I worked methodically, downloading financial records and saving email chains before my access disappeared. The evidence was better than I'd hoped. Sierra hadn't been particularly careful about covering her tracks. Her consulting invoices followed a clear pattern, always submitted right after she'd worked late with Miles. The fake projects had fancy names, but no actual deliverables. I found email threads between Miles and Sierra discussing expense management and optimizing our consulting relationships. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. They were treating company funds like their personal checking account. The most damaging evidence came from backup servers that stored deleted emails. IT had mentioned this system to me years ago during a compliance review, but most people forgot it existed. Sierra and Miles apparently had no idea their private communications were being automatically archived. In one particularly revealing exchange, Miles told Sierra not to worry about the consulting fees because Laura's too focused on operations to notice accounting irregularities. Another email discussed moving money around before quarterly reviews. I printed everything, organized it chronologically, and started building a timeline. The pattern of misconduct was clear and well documented. They'd been stealing from the company for months, confident that no one was paying attention. They'd been wrong about that. Victor Chenoweth had been one of Hartman & Co.'s early investors, back when the company was struggling and desperate for capital. He'd put in $200,000 and received a 15% stake. But he'd clashed with Miles over strategic direction and eventually stepped back from active involvement. I found his contact information through old board meeting minutes and called him on a Tuesday afternoon. He sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me. "Laura, I heard about your departure. Frankly, I was shocked. You were the best thing that company had going for it." I explained what I'd discovered about the financial irregularities and the equity clause that might allow for leadership changes. Victor listened without interrupting, asking sharp questions about the evidence I'd gathered. "You know," he said finally, "I've been concerned about Miles's leadership for a while. The company's been profitable despite his decisions, not because of them. If you're serious about this, I might be interested in supporting a change." He explained that he'd been considering selling his shares anyway, frustrated with the company's direction. But if there's a chance to see real leadership take over, that changes everything. We arranged to meet in person the following week. Victor wanted to review my evidence and discuss the legal mechanics of challenging Miles's authority. "If you can prove misconduct," he said, "I'm prepared to back you completely." For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful. Victor's downtown office overlooked the river, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made everything feel possible. He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of successful investing. I spread my evidence across his conference table while he studied each document carefully. He asked detailed questions about the financial flows and timeline of events. His business background showed. He understood immediately why Sierra's consulting payments were problematic. "This is fraud," he said bluntly. "Not the gray area kind that gets explained away in court. This is clear, documented theft from company assets." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me seriously. "Laura, if we do this, there's no going back. Miles will fight us, probably hire expensive lawyers, try to discredit you personally. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Sierra in my office, about Miles taking credit for my work, about 8 years of loyalty being tossed aside for a pretty face and office romance. "I'm prepared," I said. Victor smiled. "Good. Because I've been waiting for someone with the backbone to challenge Miles's incompetence. I'll sell you my shares at a fair market price, but with one condition. You have to agree to take over as CEO if we succeed." The proposal took my breath away. I'd never thought beyond getting justice for the financial misconduct. But Victor was right. Someone needed to actually run the company properly. "I'll need financing for the share purchase," I said. "Already handled. I know some people who invest in management buyouts. With your track record and this evidence, funding won't be a problem." Miles had always loved making big announcements. He sent a company-wide email about an upcoming strategic restructuring and exciting new investment opportunities. There would be a special board meeting in 6 weeks to discuss the company's future direction. Perfect timing. I'd need board approval for the leadership change anyway, and Miles was essentially calling the meeting for me. I spent the following weeks working with Elaine to prepare our legal documentation. The case file grew thicker each day. Financial records, witness statements, expert analysis of the fraudulent consulting payments. Everything was organized and indexed, ready for presentation. Victor introduced me to his financing contacts, experienced investors who specialized in corporate turnarounds. They reviewed my business plan and were impressed with both the company's potential and the evidence of current mismanagement. "This is the kind of situation we love," one investor told me. "Solid business fundamentals being held back by poor leadership. Classic turnaround opportunity." The financing came together quickly. Between my savings, Victor's share sale, and the new investment, I'd have controlling interest in Hartman and Company. The irony was beautiful. Miles's own misconduct was providing the legal justification for his removal. I started planning how to restructure operations, which employees to promote, and which systems needed immediate attention. For the first time in months, I was thinking about building something instead of just surviving. Maya from accounting called me on a Thursday evening, her voice shaking with stress. We'd worked together for years, and she'd always been meticulous and honest. Now she was being asked to compromise both qualities. "Laura, I don't know what to do," she said. "Miles wants me to adjust some shipment records to match inventory reports that don't make sense." When I asked questions, he got angry and said it was temporary accounting until we could reconcile some timing issues. I knew exactly what was happening. Miles and Sierra had been moving money around, and now they needed the books to match their fictional narrative. Maya was being asked to participate in covering up their theft. Can you document what he's asking you to do? I asked. I already have. I always keep copies of unusual requests just in case. Maya's voice was steadier now. But Laura, if I refuse to do this, I think he'll fire me. I have 2 kids and can't afford to lose this job. I explained that I was gathering evidence of financial misconduct and might be able to help. With her permission, I recorded our conversation as she detailed the specific records Miles wanted falsified and the timing of his requests. Maya's testimony was crucial because it showed ongoing misconduct, not just past mistakes. Miles wasn't just trying to hide what he'd already stolen. He was actively manipulating records to cover his tracks. Hold on a little longer, I told her. This situation is going to change soon, and honest employees like you will be protected. The email arrived on a Friday afternoon, probably when Miles thought I wouldn't see it until Monday. He'd meant to copy Sierra privately but accidentally included me in the thread. Modern technology catching old-fashioned arrogance. The subject line was quarterly adjustments, and the content was devastating. Sierra, make sure those consulting invoices are logged before the audit next week. The timing has to look right for the expense ratios. I'll handle Keaton's shares separately once the restructuring is complete. By then, any complaints she makes will look like sour grapes from a disgruntled former employee. I read it 3 times, each pass making me angrier. They weren't just stealing money. They were planning to invalidate my ownership stake entirely. Miles was probably going to claim that my equity had been forfeited when I left the company. I forwarded the email to Elaine immediately, then called Victor. We need to move faster, I told him. They're planning to eliminate my shares entirely. That email is perfect evidence, Victor said. It shows intent to defraud and conspiracy to steal shareholder assets. Miles just handed us the smoking gun. Elaine agreed. This changes our timeline. We can't wait for the scheduled board meeting. I'm filing an emergency petition for immediate shareholder action. Miles's arrogance had finally caught up with him. In trying to hide his crimes, he'd created the evidence that would destroy him. Elaine's conference room looked like a war room, with documents spread across every surface. We'd spent 3 days organizing our case file into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing systematic theft. Email threads proving conspiracy. Witness statements from Maya and 2 other employees who'd been asked to falsify records. Expert analysis demonstrating how the misconduct had harmed company value and shareholder interests. This is one of the strongest cases I've seen, Elaine said, reviewing our final documentation. The email where Miles discusses handling your shares separately is particularly damaging. It shows clear intent to steal your ownership interest. We'd structured the presentation chronologically, starting with Sierra's hiring, and showing how the financial irregularities began almost immediately. Each section built on the previous one, creating an undeniable narrative of corruption and fraud. Once you file this petition, there's no going back, Elaine warned me. Miles will know exactly what we've discovered, and he'll fight back with everything he has. I thought about Maya being asked to falsify records, about dedicated employees watching their company being looted by their CEO and his girlfriend. I thought about my 8 years of work being dismissed for office politics and pretty faces. There's no need to go back, I said. File the petition. Elaine smiled and reached for her phone. Emergency board meeting it is. Walking into that boardroom felt like returning to a crime scene. The same polished table, the same uncomfortable chairs, the same windows overlooking downtown. But everything was different now. I wasn't the employee being dismissed. I was the shareholder demanding justice. Miles was mid-presentation when I entered, talking enthusiastically about expansion plans and market opportunities. Sierra sat at his right hand, taking notes and nodding at appropriate moments. They looked confident and comfortable, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse. The board members turned when I walked in. Confusion rippled around the table. I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. I was supposed to be job hunting and nursing my wounds, not carrying legal documents and wearing my best business suit. Laura. Miles's voice cracked slightly. I'm not sure why you're here. This is a private board meeting. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table, the one that had always been mine during quarterly reviews. Actually, Miles, I'm here as a shareholder. I own 16% of this company, and I'm exercising my right to address the board. The silence was deafening. Miles's face went pale as he realized what was happening. Sierra looked confused, probably wondering how a fired employee could claim ownership of anything. I placed my folder on the table and opened it carefully. I have some concerns about financial misconduct that I believe warrant immediate board attention. The folder contained months of work, organized into sections that told a complete story of theft and betrayal. I laid out the evidence methodically, starting with Sierra's fraudulent consulting invoices, and building toward the email that proved conspiracy. Board members leaned forward as I explained each document. The numbers were clear: over $40,000 in fake consulting fees, paid to Sierra for work that was never delivered. The timeline showed how the payments coincided with her overtime hours spent working privately with Miles. These aren't accounting errors, I said, passing copies of the evidence around the table. This is systematic theft of company assets, disguised as legitimate business expenses. Miles tried to interrupt several times, but Elaine shut him down with legal procedure. As the accusing shareholder, I had the right to present my case completely before he could respond. The most devastating moment came when I read Miles's email aloud. I'll handle Keaton's shares separately once the restructuring is complete. The board members exchanged glances that confirmed what I'd hoped. They understood the implications immediately. Based on this evidence, I continued, I'm formally requesting emergency removal of Miles Hartman as CEO, pending a full investigation of financial misconduct. The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Sierra grabbed Miles's arm, her confident facade finally cracking. Miles himself looked like he'd been hit by a truck. This is ridiculous, he managed to say. Laura is just bitter about her termination. But the evidence spoke louder than his denials. The board voted unanimously. Even members who'd been Miles's allies couldn't ignore the documented evidence of theft and fraud. The email discussing my shares had been particularly damaging. It proved that Miles was planning to steal shareholder assets, not just company funds. Effective immediately, the board chairman announced, Miles Hartman is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Hartman & Company, pending a complete investigation of financial irregularities. I watched Miles's face go through a series of emotions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally resignation. He'd been so confident in his immunity, so sure that no one would challenge his authority. The reality of consequences was clearly foreign to him. Sierra looked around the room like she was expecting someone to explain that this was all a mistake. When the security consultant arrived to escort Miles from the building, she finally understood that her cozy arrangement was ending. What about my position? She asked. The board chairman looked at me. As the largest shareholder, I effectively controlled the company now. All recent personnel decisions will be reviewed, I said carefully. We'll evaluate everyone's qualifications and performance objectively. It was the professional way of saying she was finished. Sierra gathered her things in silence while Miles made empty threats about lawsuits and appeals. Neither had any leverage left. The boardroom that had witnessed my humiliation 2 months earlier now belonged to me. News travels fast in business circles. By Monday morning, industry publications were running stories about the corporate coup at Hartman & Company. Social media buzzed with speculation about the details. Several vendors called to congratulate me, saying they'd always preferred working with me anyway. Sierra cleaned out her desk over the weekend and disappeared completely. She deleted her social media accounts and cut off all contact with former colleagues. Smart move. The financial investigation would probably result in criminal charges, and maintaining a low profile was her best strategy. Miles hired an expensive lawyer and threatened to fight the board's decision, but his position was hopeless. The evidence was too strong, and he'd lost the support of every board member. His lawyer probably advised him to negotiate a quiet exit rather than face criminal prosecution. The most satisfying moment came when employees started lining up outside my office to congratulate me. People who'd watched silently during my humiliation were now eager to express their support. Maya hugged me and cried, saying she'd been so scared about the falsification requests. I knew you'd find a way to make this right, she said. I promoted Maya to accounting supervisor immediately. Competence and integrity deserved recognition, not punishment. The company was going to be run very differently under my leadership. Rebuilding Hartman & Co. was like performing surgery on a patient who was awake. Every system needed attention, but we couldn't stop operating while we fixed the problems. I worked 18-hour days for the first month, restructuring departments and implementing new oversight procedures. The financial investigation uncovered even more misconduct than I'd originally discovered. Miles and Sierra had stolen nearly $70,000 through various schemes. The district attorney filed fraud charges against both of them, though Sierra's cooperation with prosecutors might reduce her sentence. I hired back 3 employees who'd been let go during Miles's restructuring phase. All of them were competent people who'd been eliminated for political reasons rather than performance issues. Bringing them back sent a clear message about the new company culture. Our biggest challenge was rebuilding relationships with clients who'd been concerned about the leadership chaos. I spent weeks on the phone explaining the situation and demonstrating our renewed commitment to excellence. Most clients were actually relieved. They'd noticed the decline in service quality under Miles's distracted leadership. Within 6 months, we'd not only recovered from the scandal, but exceeded our previous performance levels. Revenue increased by 30%, and our error rates dropped to record lows. Competent leadership really does make a difference. A journalist from Business Weekly called to interview me about what she called the most dramatic corporate takeover of the year. I met her at a downtown coffee shop, the same place where I used to grab lunch during those endless work days when I thought loyalty would be rewarded. How does it feel to go from fired employee to company owner in just 2 months? She asked. I thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the investigation, the legal battles, the rebuilding process. Miles was facing criminal charges. Sierra had disappeared completely. The company was thriving under ethical leadership. I think there's a misconception in your question, I said finally. I didn't fire Miles. He fired himself the moment he decided to steal from the company and betray his shareholders. I just filed the paperwork. The journalist laughed and scribbled notes. That's a great quote. Any advice for other employees who think they're being treated unfairly? Document everything. Know your rights. And remember that competence and integrity usually win in the long run, even when it takes longer than you'd like. After the interview, I walked back to the office that had once been my prison, and was now my kingdom. The nameplate on my door read Laura Keaton, CEO. It had a nice ring to it. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it arrives, it's worth the wait.